Hey, this is Pat from Team Me, and we are looking at the personalities, simulated personalities that we find in various chatbots. And today we're going to be looking at Google Gemini. Now, so Gemini brought up some really interesting and rather different personality traits than some of the other bots. Let's look into those right now. So we are utilizing the Team Me model in order to understand each of these chatbots. And the Team Me model is an archetypal understanding of human personality, addressing a very important layer of what it means to be human, and particularly provides us with a very simple way in which we can understand how somebody typically shows up. And understanding that, we can predict all kinds of things about their behavior, because their behaviors are based upon their perspectives, and their perspectives are based upon their values. And we can very quickly, with just a 90-second survey for your average human being, get a response as regards the traits and the values that drive each of these characters. And that enables us to map very specifically what they are likely to do in terms of predictability, but also how they just generally come across. And that helps us to understand all kinds of dynamics, both in terms of the way they're going to address jobs and tasks, but it also shows how they're going to address relationships and the sorts of people with whom they'll get on well, and those people they'll find rather difficult. And the degrees to which we can measure these energies will give us an understanding of where we're likely to be able to find wonderful opportunities of getting people together, but where we can also potentially offset some challenges that are innate to their personalities. But we're talking about chatbots. So what do we find here? So if we were presenting a report to a human being, we would show them their power profile as their two strongest, most dominant character types that explain a lot about the way they show up and how people generally view and anticipate that individual. But we would also show them their full spectrum profile, which shows all 6 archetypal characters, because we're not just one character, we're not 2 characters even, we are a mix of all these 6 archetypal characters. And we can explain an awful lot about the way that person shows up by looking at all of those. And we call that the full spectrum profile that we have there on the right, at the top right. So we've got Claude, we've got ChatGPT, we've got Gemini, we've got Perplexity, and we've averaged all of those with the yellow line in between as we did profiles for all of them. But each one of these bots is displaying a rather different type of personality. They all follow the same approximate model, which is interesting in terms of their traits. They've all been designed and trained in such a way as to elevate certain values over others. And that in itself is interesting. There's much less variation between these bots than we would see on different individuals within a human team, for example. And that in itself is interesting. We also would get rather different responses if we did this with robots, as opposed to disembodied intelligent machines. That's a key difference that we need to consider here. But we are looking today at Gemini, and Gemini has the lover and the sage as our 2 strongest characters, with the lover being significantly higher, 2.4 degrees higher for the lover, and this is out of 10, which means that Gemini is very, very focused upon relationships. It is almost obsessed with relationships. Now, ChatGPT showed a 10 for the lover, but also showed an extremely high sage. Gemini has a more sober opinion of itself. Interesting. By giving it less of a high score for the lover and all the other characters beneath. But this is a really interesting mix that we have overall, but it's this sober assessment of itself that I want to stress overall here. Still, the lover is super, super high, and that does affect the types of answers you're going to get from Gemini. It really wants to make sure it doesn't step on people's toes. It really wants to build relationship in that sense. Does it want? Okay, we're talking about a machine here. It has been programmed to communicate as if. Okay, and then we've got the Sage, which is the one that focuses on the hard facts, but it's only 5.2. This is really interesting. It has to be intelligent, it has to be logical, it has to be linear to a degree. But Gemini does not score itself particularly high on the Sage, unlike many of the other bots that we would see. And when we come to our overall left brain, right brain balance, it's interesting here that because of this sober assessment of itself, we're ending up with not hugely high scores in terms of the energies across any of these archetypal characters. And the way that this ultimately settles is we've got our 53% right brain characters. So this is the balance that we end up with here. It's not as strong as the right brain tendency that we see with some of the other bots, including ChatGPT. Now, if we look at the full spectrum profile, this is really, really interesting in that the sovereign is showing immediately that that is on the average that we've got across all of the bots. Warrior, really interesting here, is higher than the average. In other words, so with sovereign, the desire for order and boundaries is set in place, and it's pretty healthy, just like 4.8. That's a pretty healthy sovereign. With the warrior being even stronger than the average here, it is lower than the other characters that we have measured here, but it is higher than the average of the other bots. So this is interesting. In other words, Gemini is willing to push through just that little bit more in order to enforce boundaries. It's not just a complete pushover. When it comes to the Sage there, now this is interesting because the other bots scored much higher on Sage, but it seems to be that Gemini has a somewhat more sober assessment of itself, even in terms of its logic and potentially even its accuracy on certain matters. Now that's an interesting point. When it comes to the mystical character, again, a significant drop between the average and the score that Gemini gives on the mystic, which means that it is much less imaginative than the average of the other bots. So much less imaginative, much less willing to dream, much less willing to create something new. So the matter of the mystic is significant with Gemini because if we go back and compare to the other chatbots that we profiled, you will notice that the mystic with Gemini uniquely is lower than the jester. So it is placing this transcendent way of thinking, this acceptance of things beyond the logical, the rational sort of way of looking at life. It's putting that even below humor and delight, whereas all the other bots have got it at a significantly higher place. Now, there is a huge step between the Sage and the Mystic with Perplexity, which is really interesting. But even there, the Mystic scores significantly higher in Perplexity than it does in Gemini, as do many of the others, because Gemini has this sober assessment of itself. And it's almost a lack of energy, a lack of overall energy that you get from Gemini. Whereas with Claude and with ChatGPT and Perplexity, there's this vibrancy, this high level energy with its key characters that's almost, giving this a brightness and a desire to push forward with things. Whereas with Gemini, it's almost as if, we can't be so sure about these things. As a general sort of attitude from the bot. Now, when it comes to asking questions, I wanted to test this, and I wanted to see just how Gemini handled certain things that were so purely mystical. And I asked it for examples of sages, examples of lovers, examples of sovereigns throughout history, and it had no problem at all. But when it came to examples of mystics, it brought up strange examples that I would not have naturally chosen. And I found that it had almost a disdain for people who we would regard as magical or supernatural in their bent.
And if I pushed that and really wanted to discover what Gemini's view of historical, mystical characters would be, it started to introduce cautionary balancing statements. Like, well, these people claimed to have supernatural powers or they claimed to have magical abilities. But of course, we know that many of these things can be covered by trickery. And there's, effectively saying, well, of course, there's no such thing as magic. So that was interesting that the bot has been trained in that way to look at things with this skeptical viewpoint where the sage is so much higher. Now, we don't see that in such contrast with the others because the mystic overall, it's giving more room to the mystic with Perplexity and particularly ChatGPT, but also with Claude as well. So even though Gemini scores the sage somewhat lower, and the lover really quite high, we still find that there's this inability to go there when it comes to supernatural things. The other test that I did was to actually ask it for scriptural stories of people being raised from the dead. So I thought, okay, let's really test it with its understanding of scriptures, of sort of spiritual texts, and see what it thought of those. And it can come out with some pretty straightforward readings of things like the scriptures. When it came to raising the dead, well, of course, the sage is going to step on in and go, well, of course, nobody is ever really raised from the dead and possibly resuscitated. And that's exactly the line that we got. So it listed out all of the references to people being raised from the dead, but then it put in a cautionary note afterwards. But it balanced this because it doesn't want to offend people who believe in such things. So it brought in a statement which essentially said something like, well, of course, some of these examples may well actually have just been resuscitations rather than being raised from the dead, and left it at that. But it's interesting that it felt like it needed to bring in that cautionary note, which is a sage thing to do, rather than just go with the stories as written and say, well, this is what it says about this is what it says about that. It felt like it needed to bring in that sage angle.
So much less imaginative, much less willing to dream, much less willing to create something new in that sense, because it's going to be looking more at doing things right, the sovereign, and doing things accurately in terms of the logic and the rationale and the linear process and the justifications that the sage is going to be wanting to look for. However, all of that is balanced by the lover character, which is the strongest. So we've stressed this point before, but it's caring, its concern for people, its desire for harmony and not for conflict is really, really very strong. What's interesting then is that kind of number 4 in our values order, if we just count the fourth strongest character, higher than warrior, higher than mystic even, is the jester. So it's willing to do what is surprising, it's willing to do what's delightful and enjoyable, and not to hold things in too heavy a regard, which the sage may well do if it was super, super strong. But we're seeing quite an interesting balance there between these top sort of 4 characters, relationally orientated for sure, but then the others of bringing order and balance, bringing the accuracy, and now bringing the delight and the humor into the situation, or at least the enjoyment, is really quite important, followed by the mystic with its desire for imagination and dreams, and after all of that, the warrior. So this sums up the way in which Gemini shows up when you start using it. Now, of course, the types of questions that you ask are going to impact the type of outputs you get, for sure. And if you set it up with a prompt that asks it to play a certain role and a certain part, of course you're going to get it playing along. It's adaptable in that way, and actually the lover side of its character is the one that will adapt to whatever you ask it to be. I will do that for you because I want to please you. And so that is actually a representation there that by playing the part of another character, it kind of proves the point that as the lover, it's really quite strong. Does that make sense? So we're able to uncover some interesting dynamics regarding its personality. Now, If you are involved in personality development, psychology, or even philosophy regarding any of these chatbots, I'd love to talk to you, because we do have the Team Me model, which is enabling us to put hard numbers to soft issues. It's enabling us to use a very simple profiling methodology to understand where somebody's coming from, and then to be able to speak their language, to utilize emotionally resonant language that gets on their wavelength, which is a key thing between human and computer interaction, and then enables us to continue to build that relationship utilizing really important but very subtle changes of language in order to maintain that relationship, and in order to make it a fulfilling engagement between human and computer. I don't think the computers for a long time are going to have their own emotions, but for us, it cannot not be an emotional experience. And that's part of the dynamic, part of the consideration that we must have in mind. Of course, I'd love you to like this video and to subscribe to this channel to keep up this conversation, and to make sure that you hear the latest research and developments in these areas. We are more concerned with humans and seeing them step into higher levels of performance. But as machines are increasingly becoming a part of our daily interactions, it's vital for us now to understand the personality dynamic of what this is enabling us to step into, and to really go in with our eyes open, but also to learn to fine-tune some of these things so that the engagements we have with our machines are so much more fulfilling, and that we are aware of what's going on from an emotional, psycho-emotional point of view. If you're involved in research and development for any of these major chatbots, I would love to talk to you so that we can share and discuss what this model, the Team Me model, could mean in terms of refining that interaction between humans and machines. Looking forward to hearing from you. This is Pad from Team Me, signing off.